Welcome to the beginning of Chapter 5. So far, most of my graduation thesis followed the pattern of examining a variety of smaller examples to illustrate larger developments, but it was also common practice for a thesis like this to finish with an extensive analysis of one concrete work. And so, in the final chapter, I wanted to go into a different direction and thoroughly analyze one concrete example. And for that, I chose the PlayStation 2 video game Silent Hill 2, developed by Team Silent and published by Konami in 2001. It is one of the most psychological and metaphor-heavy installments of the entire Silent Hill series. On top of that, it tells a story that is mostly detached from the plot of the other games and therefore well suited for an in-depth analysis that doesn't have to constantly reference plot points from other Silent Hill titles. Now, I know that these days you can find numerous analyses of Silent Hill 2, be it in video or written form, on the internet or in books, magazines, etc. So it may feel like I'm doing something that way too many have already done at this point, but you have to keep in mind that back when I wrote my thesis, such analyses were still rather rare, so it was a comparatively novel thing to do at the time. Be that as it may, in my experience, even if you read dozens of papers on the same topic, there might still be some new thoughts and ideas in the next one that haven't been brought up in any of the previous ones, and so I hope that I will have a few interesting points to make as well, even for those of you who have already consumed their fair share of Silent Hill 2 analyses in the past. So, let's begin. 5.1 A Story of Guilt and Repression. Okay, first of all, I will give a brief summary of Silent Hill 2's plot, touching on all the main points that will be important for the following videos. The game begins with protagonist James Sunderland, who takes a look at himself in the mirror of a rundown public restroom and then steps outside onto a parking area where the view opens up onto the town of Silent Hill. There, he starts a monologue, telling us about a letter that he received, supposedly sent to him by his wife, Mary, even though she died of a disease 3 years ago. The letter states that she is waiting for him in the town of Silent Hill. That should, of course, be impossible, but it didn't stop James from following the call, and so he descends into Silent Hill, trying to find Mary and with her, the truth behind the obscure letter. Just like in other titles of Silent Hill, the town itself is mostly deserted apart from a few exceptions. The other characters that James encounters during his journey through the ghost town are a young woman called Angela, an obese young man called Eddie, a little girl called Laura, and the mysterious Maria, who, according to James, resembles his dead wife Mary so much that they could be twins. And of course, there are lots of monsters. Eventually, towards the end of the game, we learn that while Mary was indeed terminally ill, her actual death was caused by James himself, because James had suffocated his sick wife with a pillow. But the weight of this crime was too heavy for him and he eventually repressed all memories of it. Concerning James' motives for murder, the game doesn't answer everything explicitly, but definitely hints at the following complex conflicts both within and between James and Mary that culminated in this tragedy. First off, although this might still oversimplify things, you could say that Mary, both physically disfigured and mentally drained by her disease, was torn between her desire to keep on living and her wish for all the suffering, both that of herself and that of James, to end already. And although she still loved James, her hatred for this disease that had taken so much from her could at times cause her to lash out at everything and everyone, even at James, whom she chased out of her sick room with harsh and hurtful words at least once.
I brought you some flowers.
Flowers? I don't want any damn flowers. Just go home already.
Mary, what are you saying?
Look, I'm disgusting. I don't deserve flowers. Between the disease and the drugs, I look like a monster. Well, what are you looking at? Get the hell out of here! Leave me alone already! I'm no use to anyone. I'll be dead soon anyway. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow. It'd be easier if they'd just kill me. But I guess the hospital is making a nice profit off me. They want to keep me alive. Are you still here? I told you to go! Are you deaf? Don't come back! When I first learned that I was going to die, I just didn't want to accept it. I was so angry all the time, and I struck out at everyone I loved most. Especially you, James.
James, on the other hand, was similarly torn between his love for Mary, or perhaps his love for the woman that Mary had been before the illness had changed her, and opposing feelings because the helpless and sometimes even aggressive Mary had turned into a great and heavy burden that began to dominate every aspect of his life.
That's why I did it, honey. I just couldn't watch you suffer. No. That's not true. You also said you didn't want to die. The truth is, I hated you. I wanted you out of the way. I wanted my life back.
It's quite possible that both was true for him. He wanted her suffering to end, but he also wanted the burden to be gone, so he could be free and live his own life again. The mysterious Maria is never explicitly explained either, but just like many of the monsters and other aspects of the game, she could be seen as a being that was born from James' mind. On the surface, one might think that she was simply born from his wish to see Mary again, but there's the following angle that needs to be considered as well. Most couples in a relationship usually have sexual urges and desires, and so ideally they are sexually active together on some kind of regular basis. However, the disease forced Mary to become bedridden, immobile, passive, which probably, and understandably so, also killed most of her sex drive and made it impossible for her to engage in any such activity, whereas James remained healthy but now unable to satisfy any of his desires, which eventually forced him to repress his sexual urges. And against this background, Maria can be seen as a manifestation of these repressed sexual urges, as she looks like a much more sexualized version of Mary and often acts unmistakably seductive towards James. Now, it is possible to interpret everything that happens in-game as mere illusions that take place in James' head, but I would argue that the town of Silent Hill could also be seen as more than just a passive location in this game. We could even view it as another character within Silent Hill 2's plot, because in my opinion, the town seems to act like an elusive entity that calls people into its realm where it confronts them, creates manifestations of their repressed memories and urges, and ultimately becomes their judge and executioner. By the way, I've also heard opinions that claim that the town's power is entirely passive with no will of its own, and that those who end up there have not been actively called by the town, but have just been drawn to its power like moths to a light bulb instead. And seeing as the game is open to various interpretations, I certainly won't deny that this is a possibility as well, but in my personal interpretation, which is the one I wish to present in these final videos, I consider the town an actual entity that can act and react to those that enter its realm. Now, before I go into more detail about that, allow me to pause here and briefly outline the concept of id, ego, and superego for those who are not familiar with it. This is of course a very simplified summary, but you could say that the id is the unconscious part of your psyche that follows impulses and does whatever the hell it wants. It is said to follow the pleasure principle, which refers to a force that constantly seeks instant gratification of all your needs and urges while avoiding any kind of pain. It is also said to contain all that which you repress. The superego is also mostly unconscious, but kind of like the opposite of the id. It's the part of your psyche that acts like a judge with regards to everything you do and constantly wants you to behave in a way that follows the norms and morals you have learned from the society surrounding you. And the ego is the partially conscious portion of yourself that constantly has to mediate between these two impulses. In short, the id wants pleasure and contains anything repressed. The superego wants to follow rules, and the ego has to mediate between id, superego, and the external world as well. By the way, I'm uncertain whether or not the theory of id, ego, and superego is still considered accurate within modern psychology, but please note that that is actually irrelevant here, because my point is merely that this concept does exist and that many aspects of it might have strongly influenced the game's writers. In this regard, it does not really matter if the concept itself is still considered 100% accurate or not. But back to the topic at hand. As I said, the town of Silent Hill in this title could also be seen as another character within the game scenario in terms of id, ego, ego and superego, a part of Silent Hill behaves like what could be called a manifestation machine. It lures James into its realm via the ladder and then creates manifestations based on his id's unconscious desires, urges, and repressions, while another part of it acts like a superego, like a judge and executioner who confronts James so as to force him to remember his wrongdoing, to face his act of murder and accept the guilt of what he has done instead of running away. And so for James, the journey to Silent Hill is a journey into the unconscious, at the end of which he has to face his superego and will, depending on the player's actions, find either salvation or destruction. Now, one of the fascinating consequences of having such a psychology-heavy plot is that it adds another level of the uncanny to the game as well. Silent Hill 2 certainly contains a lot of moments that are uncanny in the more conventional sense of the word, as we have used it throughout most of this video series, but it is also uncanny in the way that Sigmund Freud defined the word. Of course, it has been quite a while that we talked about Sigmund Freud's definition of the uncanny, so as a quick refresher for those who need it, allow me to simply quote from video 1 in which this topic was discussed. There I explained that for Freud, the source of the uncanny is the emergence of repressed memories, repressed thoughts, repressed urges, and that is quite close to what James' character is all about. Okay, it's almost time to end this introductory video, but since we will regularly reference certain places, buildings, and scenes in the following videos, I will now also briefly list the order of places that the player visits in the course of the game and some important scenes related to them. Starting point is the parking area that overlooks the town of Silent Hill. There, James makes the assumption that Mary might be waiting for him in the park by the lake called Toluca Lake. He descends into the city but finds almost every path blocked that would lead him to the park. The only way forward is through an abandoned apartment complex that he has to explore until he finds an exit that leads him to the park. Arriving at the park, however, James does not encounter Mary but Maria instead, who gives him the idea that Mary could be waiting in the hotel on the other side of the lake and then joins him on his journey. On their way towards the hotel, James comes across Eddie and Laura, both of whom he has met before on his way here, but Laura has only run away from him so far and actually does so again. James and Maria follow her, which eventually leads them into a hospital. While they search the hospital looking for Laura, Maria is suddenly exhausted and decides to stay behind in one of the hospital's rooms. James eventually finds Laura but is tricked and locked in a room by her. In that room, James is attacked by bizarre creatures, and after defeating them, the hospital transforms into an alternative, nightmarish version. James reconvenes with Maria in this version of the hospital and both try to flee from there, but shortly before they can escape, Maria is murdered by a bizarre creature. This creature is best known under the name of Pyramid Head and can roughly be explained as an embodiment of James' repressed guilt and his unconscious desire to be punished, but we will get into that later. Now alone, James escapes the hospital, and outside, where night has fallen, he makes way for the hotel once again. However, the road that leads there is blocked, and weird letters point him towards a building called the Silent Hill Historical Society instead. Inside this building, he comes across a hole in one of its walls, which reveals a very long stairway that leads down into an old and abandoned prison. Therein, James wanders through increasingly surreal and seemingly impossible areas until he finally enters a door and suddenly stands outside in front of Lake Toluca in broad daylight. He paddles across the lake with a small rowing boat, enters the hotel, and eventually finds a video there that shows him a recording of what really happened to his wife. In the video, you can see James suffocate Mary with a pillow. At last, James is able to admit what he's done and regain his repressed memories. He rids himself of Pyramid Head, reaches the roof of the hotel, and has a final confrontation there. Alright, with that we have laid the foundation for the upcoming videos. In the next one we will take a look at the ladder. I hope to see you there, and as always, take care and goodbye.